let me introduce myself and then ask the panelists to do the same. A couple of housekeeping rules, just so we're all on the same page. What you're about to hear are opinions and thoughts of each of us as individuals. They don't reflect the opinions of the organizations that we work for or represent. The other piece here is this is a super interesting topic, so I would really encourage you all to get involved in the dialogue. So if you have questions, there's a mic right over here. Please feel free to come up, and we'll love to have you involved and engaged in this discussion. So a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Parikh. I'm a healthcare partner at the law firm Nixon Peabody. I work with hospital systems, MedTech companies, technology companies that are working in the healthcare field. And so I've started seeing more and more of AI being infused in technology-enabled products and services. And so I'm going to sort of use that and help bring and sort of have a conversation about these issues. Our panel here is folks that represent different fields. So first, we have Dr. Ira Hofer. Sorry, Dr. Hofer, I didn't put MD next to your name over there. He is representing industry, and so I'll give him a chance in a second. Next, we have Dr. Goldin. Dr. Goldin is a clinician, and so we're going to sort of hear from the clinical perspective. And then finally, we have Jonathan Helfgott, who is he's a former regulator, and so he's sort of going to bring the perspective of a regulator to this really interesting topic. So why don't we get started? Ira, Dr. Hofer, why don't you sort of give us a little bit of your background, and tell us how you see AI touching what you do on a day-to-day basis.
So I'm Ira Hofer. I'm a practicing anesthesiologist. I'm also the co-founder and president of Extrico Health, which is a company that was spun out of UCLA with the help of the TDG, thanks to all of you here. And we help hospitals transform their raw EHR data into actionable insights. And on my academic side, I also do a lot of research and have NIH funding around AI and predictive analytics, in the perioperative period. So I touch more and more of my time over the days and years has been spent really leveraging healthcare data in general with AI as a tool, and I like to think of it more as augmented intelligence, really to help providers make better decisions and help people live healthier lives. So I'm looking forward to participating in what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion right now.
Great. Dr. Goldin?
Yeah, so I'm Jonathan Goldin. I have two sides of this. I'm the Executive Vice Chair for Department of Radiology, overseeing 3 hospitals and 15 clinics and 500 chest x-rays a day and 400 CTs a day. And on the research side, I am the co-director of the Center for Computer Vision and Imaging Biomarkers. Very interested over the last 20 years in AI, developing advanced quantitation of image data sets. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. And Jonathan?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel discussion. Spent 10 years at the FDA, both at the Center for Devices as well as the Center for Drugs, where I actually focused on software as and in a medical device, developing policy, doing pre-market reviews, as well as developing a lot of the digital health policies when I was at the Center for Drugs as well, supporting e-clinical and FDA-regulated research and inspection perspectives as well. So I'm also going to be coming from the academic and industry side of things, where currently I also help focus companies align their commercial goals with FDA regulatory approval and reimbursement strategy. So AI is going to change the way medicine is practiced, and I'm looking forward to having a lively discussion about the different considerations and aspects that need to be taken into account in order for this valuable tool to empower our healthcare practitioners and our physicians.
Okay, awesome. So let's, the way we're gonna sort of do this panel is we're gonna first start and talk about what is AI, right? And I've got some regulatory definitions up here on the slide, but Jonathan, let me give it back to you. Why don't you tell us generally how do regulators define artificial intelligence, and then we can sort of talk about how it's used in healthcare.
Yeah, so from an FDA regulatory perspective, the technical aspects are relatively straightforward. As Dr. Sheldon mentioned earlier, the Agency has created a Center for Digital Health Excellence, and they have a lot of valuable information that's available online, training, and documents. So if you haven't had a chance to peruse that, please make sure to do so. On the compliance side, the manufacturer ultimately, whether they're developing a real AI, ML-based product, or even just a general digital health or medical device type of device, they need to provide documented evidence to the agency demonstrating that the specified requirements can be consistently fulfilled and that the finished product ultimately meets user needs. That will ultimately show that your product has met the design validation requirements. And so these are some of the fundamentals that have to be taken into account when you think about the definition of AI and the role that regulations play when you're trying to commercialize and introduce these products into the market.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Let's talk about AI perception and sort of what is the perception of what AI is going to do versus reality. Dr. Goldin, from a clinical care perspective, what is the perception of what AI is doing in healthcare right now, and what is it actually doing?
Well, that's what it's doing right now is a little more complex to where we wanted to get to. I think that healthcare, and particularly in the field that I'm in, imaging, we're overwhelmed with data. There's a huge amount of data. There's a huge amount of imaging being done on a daily basis. Some of that imaging shouldn't be done in the first place. Some of that imaging should be done. Sometimes the right imaging hasn't been done, but they've done imaging. And then when you're faced with trying to digest that data in a big operation, you have to read those radiographs, and there's only a certain number that a human can read at any one time. And so traditionally, we do everything by timestamp. And we also rely on the relying physician to say, this is urgent, I'll mark it stat. Of course, in reality, what happens, everything is marked stat because that's the only way to get things done. So where we want AI is in a couple of, in my opinion, healthcare, is in two key areas. One is to optimize our workflow. And the second one is to take away the busy, redundant work that has become part of healthcare today. I trained as a radiologist and I did pulmonary care originally, not to sift through 5,000 images to find the one thing that I'm supposed to look for, but if I see that thing, integrate that information. And so now what's happened is my job is really very, very laborious, very tedious, very time-consuming, and there's only a limit to how much I can do. So what we're looking for is for AI to change the workflow and to improve my ability to find the pertinent findings or pertinent observation clinically to facilitate a quicker workthrough for the patient.
Yeah, and that's helpful. So, to an outsider, AI is like a black box, right? So, you say there's AI and it's a black box. I don't know your thoughts on sort of how is that technology currently being used in healthcare, and what is the perception of what AI is doing versus the reality?
The biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems in healthcare right now, is the overwhelming amount of data, right? Patients are getting more and more tests. It's getting amalgamated in EHRs kind of all over the place. Then you've got waveforms, then you've got images. Now people have wearables. And as a clinician, it's almost impossible to have people go through it. And I would argue people are actually really, really bad at performing rote tasks over and over again. And I would say more educated, more specialized people, which physicians tend to be just by the length of their training, right, tend to do that even worse than the general population. So the real opportunity, right, is for something to help sift through that data and bring the important information up to the surface so the doctors can use it to make better decisions. Right? The challenge with a lot of these algorithms when it gets to the black boxes, well, how are they doing them? And one of the people brought up, I think in our keynote this morning, right, the issue of bias, right? And that's a huge issue, right, is how are these algorithms working? How are they performing on different subpopulations, and are the algorithms doing what they want? And if, the more that they're a black box, the more that these things aren't looking at, the more we have the more possible it is that there's unlikely or undesirable side effects from the algorithms themselves.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, right? Undesired side effects. So one of the things, Dr. Goldin, you were saying is, now you can, AI is going to help you optimize, do what you do best. Maybe look at the images that require your attention and maybe not the ones that don't require your attention. The flip side of that is, one of the issues right now we're dealing in the healthcare industry is physician burnout. So is, having a technology like this that, helps you identify and only look at the really hard cases, does that mean now that radiologists are looking at just the really hard cases, and so you're actually exacerbating the burnout issue because doctors are now being asked to do more than they were doing before? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, firstly, sadly, AI is not implemented to the level we're talking about. So the problem right now is that AI, we have plenty of AI around us, but none of it is integrated in our workflow, so we just don't use it. It just sits on the shelf. And so we haven't really got to this world where we have this optimized AI workflow. But if we were in that space, we did a wellness survey of our faculty about a year ago, and one of the 3 key features that came out was the time taken to get through huge amounts of data. So I think that if you were to take away that work, you would impact positively on burnout. I think the notion that potentially if you took away the easy work, the normals, and left the person with just the abnormals would make them burn out more, I'm not sure I buy that right now. I think that actually most physicians enjoy the practice, the art of medicine, not the looking and hunting through data that's very diffuse and very noisy.
Right. And that's an important point, right? So the practice of medicine is regulated. I go to conferences all the time and I say, healthcare is the second most regulated industry in the US behind nuclear energy. And so then in a really regulated industry like this, you layer on innovative technologies like AI, you sort of have a minefield of issues to work through. So Jonathan, let's talk about risks and regulatory hurdles. That's one of the common issues. If I'm using AI, what are the things I need to think through, and what's a path that you're seeing companies take that perhaps sidestep some of those really thorny, difficult challenges?
Yeah, I think the 3, let's say, technical considerations need to be taken into account are the VVNTs, the ACPs, and the standard compliance considerations. So the verification, validation, and testing, you just have to follow good software engineering and documentation practices. You have to have clearly articulated software requirement specs that minimize any ad hoc decisions by the programmers. And then for the algorithm change protocols, you're going to have to negotiate with the agency up front any potential limits on modifying the algorithm based on the machine learning rules, such that a new FDA review might actually be triggered. So keeping in mind that there are some constraints on how the algorithm will be able to perform over time within the context of your FDA-approved indication. And then, of course, there's just the standard access controls, network, data privacy, support. And to answer your direct question, I think companies need to move away from trying to replace the physicians or healthcare practitioners, but rather develop tools that are going to enable them, empower them, at best provide and facilitate the de-skilling of healthcare. And this will allow the radiologists and the other physicians to maximize their time triaging patients and delivering quality care.
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So one of the things you said is, if the machine is making diagnosing or is, coming up with treatment recommendations, from a legal perspective, the question then is the machine practicing medicine? And that, that's just a really tough pathway to go down. But then it's sort of the other pathway that I see a lot, and maybe Ira, you can talk about this, is giving tools to physicians or providers. And so the AI algorithm in that situation is providing clinical decision support. It's not diagnosing or treating, it's supporting doctors, providers, other clinicians do what they're doing, just providing additional data source for them to look at. Ira, I know your company's kind of doing some of that and Harbor, looking at EHR data. Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately companies that are going to be successful, right? And this is a MedTech conference, right? So it's about companies that are going to be successful or solving problems that people are facing, on a day-to-day basis, right? And when you're talking about providers, I mean, the two physicians up here have both said it. I think it's, most doctors would say the same. It is about overwhelming amounts of data, right? And the more that data can be distilled into actionable pieces of information, the better that you're going to enable the providers to do that. Now that can be clinical decision support at the point of care, right? It can be risk stratification and identification of high risk patients, right? And it can be more retrospective information in terms of dashboards, finding opportunities for quality. What are the things that are being missed? But all of this requires, I think, real engagement with the end users. And it comes back to good old-fashioned business of, know your customer, know what your customer wants, and try to provide products that make your customer's life better, right?
Right. And so, when you talk about AI really depends on the data, right? So garbage in, garbage out sort of thing. So Dr. Goldin, would love to get your thoughts on, AI and leveraging data. Like what, do we have issues with that data set that is used to build AI, and what, how do you sort of think through using appropriate data source?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting for me because 20 years ago we started doing computer vision and machine learning and early forms of deep learning, and nobody cared. And now it's so cool. Everybody thinks the AI is really cool, and I'm cool, and you're cool, and we're all cool. Well, I think Google showed the best, right? You can't take a bunch of data and pump out a machine. And they had legendary failures in the academic and public world, and I think they summed it up. So I think at the end of the day, the hope with deep learning networks was that you could overwhelm the problems by the amount of data, and out would come an answer. And I think we're more and more coming to grips with the fact that, you'll get an answer that works at a group level, but not at a patient level. And so to get down to the patient level, you need structured, clean data on the one hand, and if you're going to do an algorithm that's going to participate in diagnosis of a patient or treatment of a patient, you have to have good clinical data supporting that what you have developed actually does what you think it does beyond just a few test beds. And this is where I think the compliance and regulatory gets a bit confusing. People often see the 510K clearance as the hurdle. I can assure you that right now at UCLA Department of Radiology, we probably have about 30 510K cleared platforms over the last 10 years. None of them are currently being used in routine, everyday practice. We actually do an inventory about every few years and throw them all out and start again. Now that says something about us as well. We're overwhelmed and can't take in new stuff, but there's a lot going on here.
And the key is just to submit a new 510K referencing your previously substantial equivalent devices.
But I mean, I would just say I think what differentiates AI from healthcare from a lot of other industries, right, are the stakes, right? And, working inside hospitals, and so many of my colleagues have the same thing, the hospital goes and they hire someone who's brilliant, who's been doing software development in AI, at Airbnb, right, and has done phenomenal algorithms. And they get there and they think, oh, we've got to figure it out because Airbnb is doing it and you're not. And what they don't get, and I think this is what clinicians understand because we care for patients on a regular basis, if your Maps app tells you to take the wrong highway and you get home 15 minutes later, it's really not a big deal, okay? When the app tells you the chest x-ray is irrelevant and you don't have to look at it, and there was a lung cancer in there or, a pneumonia or some other major finding and the patient dies, that's another ballgame. In my, world of, risk stratification, if it says don't operate on this patient because they're too high a surgical risk, and they have what you're now saying is an inoperable tumor, okay, you've now given that patient a life sentence, okay? The stakes are totally different. And when we talked before about provider engagement, right, that's what it is. You have to be able to convince not just the FDA and their own concerns and, I would argue issues in terms of like the regulatory framework, but you're gonna have to convince providers that they're comfortable relying on that, right? And that requires real rigorous work in understanding what's at stake.
Jonathan, you were at the FDA for 10 years, so I'd love to get your thoughts on, do the regulators appreciate some of the things that that we're hearing from the other panelists?
Yes, of course. Remember, FDA's Hotel California, so very apropos. I think from a regulatory perspective, you have to appreciate that the devices themselves are regulated in many different ways, and not all marketing authorizations are equal. So, for example, in imaging, it was just brought to my attention, there is a single frontline type of read tool out there. But most of the diagnostic aids and clinical data decision support system tools, you have to read the fine print, where it actually says the physician or the healthcare practitioner is still expected to do an independent read, and this is just an additional piece of information that can help facilitate the process, whether it's diagnosis or delivery of treatment. Now, we know in reality, once the physicians get more comfortable with certain tools, they can configure it certain ways, the sensitivity, the specificity is exactly the way they want it, well, perhaps it can be an effective mode if indeed you aren't missing and having those false negatives. That really is what's critical. And that's what's going to drive what kind of evidence you need to prove that your product is going to consistently work.
Right. So on the screen, on the slide here, just some terms that we've been using. I wanted to make sure everybody was speaking the same language. So we talked a little bit about legal barriers, right, and sort of why it's difficult to innovate and use AI in healthcare. When I have a young MedTech client, the first question we ask is, do you really want to be a healthcare company, or do you want to be more of a wellness sort of nutrition, providing not healthcare diagnosing or advice, but more sort of, you're in a wellness space. And so that space is much less regulated. So a lot of times, when I talk to young MedTech clients, that's the route we go, right? Because it's easier to get to market. There isn't as many roadblocks, and you're not touching healthcare. But as soon as you step into the world of diagnosing and treating, then you have all of the panoplies of regulatory hurdles that we deal with. Let's take one of these, reimbursement, for example. Right. So, Dr. Goldin, we were talking about this earlier. In terms of reimbursement, right? I work at a law firm. We create all sorts of different unique payment models. Like, how do we get doctors to get patients out that have been at the hospital for too long, or perform these primary care visits for this population. So we create all these weird, cool incentives, but then when it actually gets into process and it's being implemented, we see lots of roadblocks, right? Like, just being able to incentivize behaviors is really tough. So Dr. Goldin, what your thoughts on hurdles that companies face when they try to use AI in healthcare, especially on the reimbursement side?
Yeah, this requires a couple of beers and scotches and a lot of alcohol. The problem here is who's being incentivized, right? The physician is being incentivized in one way, the hospital being incentivized in another way. Who's buying the piece of software? What's the software going to do, or the device going to do? Who's going to get the benefit of having the device in the place? So, that's one big area. The next big area, of course, is how do you do it? In my world, the discussion is always, is it per click or is it a service model? And this is a big debate that people fly around with all the time. And, if you're doing a few cases a day, per click might make sense. But if we're doing, as we do, thousands of cases a day, this is not a very exciting model. But then you have companies like Zebra who came out, or Zebra as you Americans like to call them. Zebra came out with a $1 a click algorithm. So it's very, very all over the place. Nobody knows how to price these things right and make it work in the environment we're working in. And we have to get everybody aligned so the incentives are the same.
Yeah, Ira, this is like the problem your company seems to be trying to solve, right? Trying to get data and sort of making it usable. So thoughts on barriers for companies that are trying to innovate and come up and use AI software and data. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with healthcare, and part of it stems from the regulation and part of it stems from just the way healthcare works, right, is you have lots of different players, right, and the incentives are usually orthogonal to each other, right? So you need to, if you're talking about, $1 per click, well, who's paying that, right? The radiologist isn't interested in paying it. So the hospital's going to pay it. Does the hospital want to pay to make the radiologist's life easier? Well, maybe, and then is the radiologist going to rely on it? So I think there are a lot of, challenges. And I think one of the ways our company looks at things and the way when we talk to, our customers, or as we like to say, our partners, right? It's really about, well, what are the challenges you're trying to solve, and how can we partner with you to help you leverage data to make better decisions? And that's why I like the term augmented intelligence better than artificial intelligence, because I don't think it has to be about being artificial. It has to be about augmenting the problems that they're already trying to solve, right? And I think what we've seen in every industry that's undergone a data revolution in the past, let's say 20 years, right, is as people have actionable, better information to make decisions, companies that can do that well tend to, will become more profitable, will become more successful, in the long run, right? But it's about understanding the challenges that the people in healthcare or the people you're talking to are having at the moment. And that's going to be very different depending on exactly who you're talking to.
Yeah, I mean, the example you gave, right, of a hospital typically gets paid on the MSDRG basis, meaning, based on this group of software, a patient's diagnosis is determined, and the government will say, okay, based on this diagnosis, we'll pay you X rate. And so the hospital gets that same dollar amount regardless of how long the patient stays in the inpatient setting. And again, so then we talk about incentives, and you sort of have to work your way backwards. Okay, so if the hospital is getting paid a case rate, what incentive does it have to spend more money, even if it's to improve patient safety? But if the data isn't all there, right, that we sort of get into the incentives. Jonathan, your thoughts on regulatory hurdles, and how do you sort of think past it, or how do you come up with a product or a solution that you can take to market?
Yeah, I think the key to driving effective product development and commercialization is demonstrating clear clinical associations with the finished product, right? How much meaning and credibility can be assigned to the clinical significance of your product or your software or in a medical device? How can you differentiate between A or B? And is it clinically relevant? And if so, how much? And how much evidence do you have? And I think on the reimbursement side, at a minimum, you have to have at least a plan for how you're going to engage CMS and the private payers to show that you can meet the threshold of reasonable and necessary. Now, this is, of course, after you've already proven to the FDA that your product is safe and effective. So you have to speak to things like, what kind of health economics data or health resource utilization information do I have to show the cost savings? Now, as a rule of thumb, for every dollar spent, they're going to want to see at least $3 in savings. So you have to be able to come up with a value proposition that can fill those needs. And even if a lot of the small startups don't necessarily intend to build the product and are looking for the successful exit with a nice signal, they at least have to de-risk it and show that they've thought through how they're going to address the needs for the payers and ultimately secure the coverage, coding, and reimbursement.
All right, before we move on, I want to again remind everyone there's a microphone here. We'd love to get folks involved in this discussion. I'll keep going. I've got lots more slides and other things to walk through. But if you have questions or want to engage with these distinguished panelists, please go ahead and come up. So next, there are a couple of things I think whenever you're using AI in healthcare, there's some ethical and societal impacts that I think you have to be thinking about, right? So one of the comments I made earlier is AI is really data-driven, data-dependent, so garbage in, garbage out. So Ira, thoughts on fairness, inclusiveness, bias when you're using and relying so much on data? Are you now shifting things in unknown ways, and are you maybe doing something that's causing more harm than good in the long term just because you're sort of so focused on the data set that's that's available?
Well, I think if you want to know if something happened, you need to measure it, right? And when it comes to something like bias, you need to look at those questions and see if your models are performing it. There's a well-known case study in, healthcare in terms of an algorithm that was suggesting who should be screened for prostate cancer among men. And the blacks that were in the data set were not being told to be screened as often as they should. Well, the model learned that kind of intuitively and under-recommended screening for black men. Okay, that's a problem. So if you're not looking for it, you won't know whether it's there. I mean, listen, the thesis of our company is, you need to know how to get the data out, and you need to know how to organize it and clean it in order to leverage it. And, one of the challenges of healthcare data right now, at least in my opinion, is, there are no APIs, right? There is no lightning adapter or USB-C for healthcare data, right? And it requires a lot of work for people to do it. That's essentially what our company does. I think over time, as people learn how to leverage data better, they will come up with better models. They will get more sophisticated at it. But I think we're at a point of development now where people are still figuring that out. They're figuring out how to measure bias. They're figuring out, in my own research, one of the things I've done is if you want to do image processing, right, there's a standard bunch of packages now that you can take to process an image and turn it into features for an AI algorithm, okay? That doesn't exist for labs, that doesn't exist for medications, that doesn't exist for blood pressures, that doesn't exist for waveforms, right? So there's all this data out there that we don't know how to incorporate into models. That's stuff that has to get figured out. These are certainly areas of opportunity, right? And I think, at least our company's finding good traction in terms of just being, helping people reduce the friction of doing some of these things.
Yeah, you guys have anything to add, Jonathan? Please.
Hi, I wanted to ask you in particular about the area of cancer and imaging. Very often when people come off chemo, they go for 6 months follow-up imaging, and they're declared clean. When they're not clean, they're not in fact clean because the imaging doesn't show all of the cancer cells that are actually there. So they're surprised later on when the cancer comes back when they were told that they were clean. That's one thing. The other thing is the difference between physical symptoms of the patient versus what the imaging shows. So if an imaging shows that you're clean, but your physical symptoms conflict with that, there's some issues there.
Yeah,
so I don't know if you can make it 100% accurate, the imaging.
Dr. Goldin, you and I were talking about this earlier. So I think that the first question is with respect to imaging and, what about, missing? I mean, do you think, in your view, is AI-enabled software, does that tend to be better or comparable to a physician review? And again, in the context of imaging, all of the AI products really are clinical support. So they really, maybe they'll shift through 500 images and show the radiologist, here are the 5 that you got to pay attention to. But your thoughts on, is that missing ones, or are we, do we have a situation where the image, has something and you tell somebody that they're clean, but, it actually was something that was missed because we're using these technologies?
Yeah, I think these are two slightly different things. I think the point you're coming from is that the imaging was done, there was something seen, and now it's gone, and yet the patient isn't clear. So it wasn't that it was missed necessarily, it's the fact that imaging is only one window into the health of an individual. Sure. So the power of AI is the integration of information into one place. So what you really want is that when an imaging in that particular setting, so I have a PhD working with me right now on patient-related outcomes, PROs, as they relate to imaging. And so what we find quite often is, the imaging looks really good, but the patient isn't walking up the stairs in a short of breath. Who the hell cares if my imaging looks good? And secondly, as a famous oncologist once shouted at me from Memorial Sloan Kettering, don't tell me my patient has a 3-centimeter lymph node. I don't care. They feel good and they're doing well. So imaging is only one part. So to answer your tech, where AI has a big role is integration of information. And it's a little bit different to the missing question.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan?
I think both for patient care as well as facilitating pre-market research, you want to couple, as we call, the hard and soft endpoints together. You can't just take things in isolation, whether it's how the patient feels. If the image does indeed indicate there could potentially be something wrong physiologically, and likewise, just because they don't feel well or you can't detect something, as mentioned. I mean, what AI allows us to do, as Dr. Goldin mentioned, is take all these disparate pieces of information, and if you collect it in a meaningful way and then ask the right questions, you're going to be able to hopefully avoid as much as possible these kinds of cases where it appears if you added this additional data piece, maybe you could have also not just looked at this as an image in isolation, but within the whole context of the patient. I think AI will allow us to do that, and it's gonna take some time. We're not there yet. I think the Watson experiment, as we know.
So it's the quality of the input of the information is what you get at the other end.
Garbage in, garbage out is.
And I would just say, I mean, being clean probably isn't the output, right? In other words, being clean is a label, right? What matters to the patient probably is, what's their 5-year mortality? How likely is it that they can go to work in 2 years or 6 months? Those are the things we care about as people, right? Like when you get down to it and you have those conversations, right? And, that stuff is not being captured, particularly well. I mean, I think we've all heard it, recently with COVID now. Well, one of the things that was notable for Omicron is you'd have a patient who gets hit by a car, they show up in the hospital, they get tested for COVID, they're positive, now they're a COVID patient. Well, they got hit by a car. Like, that had nothing to do with whether they had COVID or not, right? Like, so, given, pieces of data, or just that, they're given pieces of data, what we need to do with AI, right, is be able to put that into a context that then helps you make a meaningful decision. And that, I think, is like the holy grail of where we're trying to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Please, if you can introduce yourself, your name, what company you're from.
Thank you. Jim Jusko, Firelight Health, a small startup. And I wanted to ask about something you mentioned earlier, the idea that small startups could, for instance, be interested in a problem where there's a way at a cost-effective way to improve patient safety and whatnot. Most startups find gold standard clinical trials to be out of reach, but they could sometimes benefit from understanding opportunities and needs if they could access granular real-world evidence about where the issues are. What is this hospital's patient safety issues and outcomes issues in particular procedures and things where they're addressing something specifically. So since there's 2 of you are from Johns Hopkins and UCLA, how about it? How do big health systems feel about being more forthcoming and public with granular data about patient safety outcomes and needs, so that those of us trying to solve the problems can access that data and look for opportunities and solutions?
As counsel has said, there's a full disclaimer where we do not formally represent the authorized opinions of our academic research institutions for which we represent.
On background.
That being said, I think the point is well taken that we have to be able to harvest this information as meaningfully as possible. So what I would say is recognize that there's different levels and qualities and types of clinical evidence. As you mentioned, there's prospective, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. There's published peer-reviewed journals, meta-analyses, and of course, as you mentioned, there's retrospective analyses. And I think there's a huge opportunity to effectively leverage real-world data and real-world evidence from EHRs to inform the risk-benefit assessments. Again, beyond just looking at the superficial hospitalizations and death rates that often drive a lot of what the registry studies are oftentimes looking at. And the models using EHR-based data need to be proactive about establishing monitoring methods to detect and mitigate the risks of human errors, workflow issues, and calibration problems. So you have to have all 3 working in tandem: the people, the processes, and the technology to be able to drive the effective integration. And so I've also been able to use synthetic control arms with digital twins that are matching baseline characteristics in some of the FDA pivotal studies that I have right now, albeit there are exploratory endpoints. And I think over time, if we can show that bias can be mitigated and or eliminated, eventually, could they replace the need for prospective placebo sham control arms? Maybe. I think IRA has some amazing opportunities with some of the amazing work that they're doing, and maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of opportunities in terms of retrospective analysis. And I was telling Jonathan before when we were chatting, somebody introduced me to a new technique yesterday that, or last week, that leverages, genetic information to create synthetic control arms. And I think people are doing lots of innovative stuff. I think, your question in terms of like startups, and healthcare, hospitals. Listen, hospitals are businesses like everyone else, and no business is looking at airing their dirty laundry. Okay, so it's think of it like a B2B problem, like anything else. You want to go find out in the nuclear industry, in the automotive industry, what are the problems? Talk to people in those places, start to get a sense of what the issues are at the ground, and then figure out ways to measure it, right? I mean, and then quantify the value that you're bringing, as a way of quantifying the value proposition to your customer. It requires creativity because of the complexity of the landscape.
And there are a couple of open data sources. So Oshpod has data on hospitals. So that's a really good source to look at. There's lots of data you can sort of mine from that. And then CMS over the last couple of years has made its data available. So that's another place to look.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. One more question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nikita. I work at Abbott, and I was curious, you mentioned, as more and more companies incorporate AI into their algorithms, from a regulatory perspective, how do you ensure proper verification and validation of that software? Do you go all the way back to the data that feeds into the image recognition or the glucose sensing? Because there's always those outliers you can miss. And if there's a new kind of protocol for that versus just regular software that we've used in I work in cardiac rhythm management, so it's pretty old school software there. So there's a difference in that.
Yeah, I think clearly articulated indications for use and requirements that are going to drive good engineering product development practices, and then I'm sure you have the good infrastructure in place such that the way I like to think about it is forget about the regs and compliance. You need to focus on building quality into the product, and then by default, you'll dot the I's and cross the T's. So what library of algorithms that you have access to at your own organization. What can you pilfer from? What might you need to combine or start from scratch? And I think the ability to recycle what you already have is always the best strategy as opposed to starting from scratch. So, and that's actually not just for this question, I think as a rule of thumb for all the audience, try to make sure that you've done your diligence in seeing what's out there. Not just from a competitive intelligence perspective, but are there existing technologies that we could leverage, that we could build off of or integrate into our platform? So I don't know if that answers your question. Happy to
So it's almost like you trust that the organization has done their due diligence, or you kind of go through that and say oh, you have this large of a data set, it should be okay kind of thing.
Yeah, again, you kind of have to make sure you're clearly thinking and making the right decisions about what products you're going to choose to invest your limited resources in. And so once you've zoned in on what the target is, hopefully the execution is straightforward.
Interesting.
Okay, so I think we're almost out of time. Can I ask each of the speakers, maybe 2 sentences, what is the one thing that folks in this room should be thinking about with respect to AI as they're developing a product, looking at a company to invest in, or just supporting a new innovative service or product? So maybe we'll start with you, Ira.
Listen, I think AI is a tool, right? In the toolbox. It's a powerful tool if used properly. But in evaluating it, it comes back to good old-fashioned business fundamentals. Understand your customer, find a value proposition that's going to work for them, right? And then understand the regulatory landscape and what the FDA is looking for. It's a potentially powerful tool, but success is going to come back to the same things that have been determining which companies succeed for, centuries.
Dr. Goldin?
Yeah, I think you have to say what is either the clinical question or workflow optimization that's being solved, and being very clear on what that is, and then knowing how you prove that you have data to show you're doing that is where I would start.
Yeah, integration's the key to a successful commercial launch, understanding how it's going to fit into the existing standard of care paradigm, partnering with the right medical specialty groups and associations, and also recognize that it typically takes on average about 5 to 10 years for a technology to eventually become the gold standard of care. And I'll leave you all with this. For every day you can get onto the market sooner. It's not just the additional revenue that you gain, but it's all of us as patients, I think, that are going to benefit from these kinds of deserving technologies. And AI is going to revolutionize the practice of medicine as we know it, one product at a time. Let's just make sure the plans are executable, and then we can all help fill these unmet clinical needs.
Cool. Awesome. Please give a round of applause to Asadi.